Teen boy helps lost millionaire find his way. Months later, he walks into a life-changing opportunity. The heavy rain pounded against the windows of Thomas Anderson's Bentley, creating an eerie rhythm in the darkness. His trembling fingers clutched his dead phone, his last connection to the outside world gone dark. In 30 minutes, he needed to meet his lawyer about the $50 million fraud that would destroy everything he'd built over 3 decades. But here he was, lost in the poorest part of Boston, where even GPS signals feared to tread. Through the foggy windshield, he noticed a solitary figure approaching a young black teenager, drenched from the rain, carrying a worn backpack. Thomas's finger instinctively moved to lock the doors. In his world of corporate betrayals and million-dollar deceptions, trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. But then he saw something that made him pause. Despite the boy's sodden clothes and obvious exhaustion, he had stopped to help an elderly woman with her groceries, sheltering her with his own jacket. What happened next would reshape not just one life, but an entire community's destiny. Neither Thomas nor the boy could have known that this rain-soaked encounter would unravel decades of secrets, expose deep-rooted prejudices, and test the very foundations of redemption and justice. As Thomas watched the boy bid farewell to the elderly woman, he made a decision that would haunt him. He rolled down his window. Sometimes the most profound second chances come disguised as simple acts of kindness on dark, rainy nights. Have you ever wondered about the power of a single rainy night? Before we dive into this life-changing story, let us know where you're watching from and hit that like button to spread this inspiring message. In the shadows of Boston's gleaming skyscrapers, 17-year-old Michael Carter's world was far from the American dream his mother once imagined. Their modest 2-room apartment above Joe's Deli bore the familiar scent of his mother's lavender air freshener, a futile attempt to mask the persistent smell of grease from below. Sarah Carter, once a vibrant elementary school teacher, now spent most days in her second-hand recliner, her body battling stage 3 breast cancer while her spirit fought against mounting medical bills. Michael would often catch her staring at his father's old photos, yellowed pieces of paper that told stories of happier times before James Carter surrendered to the demon of addiction. The last time Michael saw his father was 5 years ago, a rain-soaked figure stumbling down their street, choosing the warm embrace of heroin over his family's love. The memory still burned, much like the twice-weekly chemotherapy sessions that left his mother too weak to work. At school, Michael maintained a quiet dignity that masked his struggles. His 4.0 GPA and position as president of the computer club painted a picture of success, but few knew he juggled 3 part-time jobs. Mornings began at 5 a.m. at Thompson's Bakery, where old Mr. Thompson paid him extra to handle deliveries before school. Afternoons found him at the local library, where he'd worked for 2 years under the watchful eye of head librarian Elizabeth Wright. Her thinly veiled disdain for his kind was offset by his love for books and the air conditioning that gave his mother relief on particularly bad days. But it was his evening job that truly defined him, though no one knew about it. 3 nights a week, Michael volunteered at the Hope Community Center, teaching basic computer skills to elderly residents and helping kids with homework. He never accepted payment, even when offered. Knowledge should be free, he'd say, while carefully tucking away the memory of how his mother used to say the same thing to her students. In his spare moments, Michael maintained a small collection of treasures: his grandfather's brass compass, perpetually pointing north despite its worn face, a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that his mother used to read to her class, and a small tin of saved coins that he hoped would someday help pay for college. The compass especially held special meaning, his grandfather's last gift before passing away, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward. The neighbors knew the Carter story well. They saw Michael helping Mrs. Rodriguez with her groceries despite his own exhaustion. They watched him fix Mr. Wilson's ancient computer for free, spending hours troubleshooting while other teenagers hung out at the mall. The community silently rallied around them, casseroles appearing on tough chemo days, anonymous envelopes with small amounts of cash slipped under their door, and always the quiet respect for a young man who refused to let circumstances define him. But life had a way of testing even the strongest spirits. When the hospital bills began to overflow their small mailbox, Michael started skipping lunch, telling his mother he ate at school while using the money for her medications. His old laptop, held together with duct tape and determination, became his gateway to learning coding through free online courses. dreaming of a future where he could provide his mother the care she deserved. The local library became his sanctuary, not just a workplace. Between shelving books and helping patrons, he'd lose himself in volumes about computer science, business, and medicine, each page a brick in the road leading away from poverty. Even Elizabeth Wright's constant supervision and occasional disparaging remarks couldn't dim his determination to learn, to grow, to somehow find a way out. What no one realized was that Michael's greatest strength wasn't his intelligence or his work ethic, it was his capacity for kindness in a world that had shown him little of it. Every morning he'd help his mother with her medications, memorizing schedules and dosages with the same precision he applied to his studies. Every night he'd tell her stories about his day, carefully editing out the hardships, painting pictures of hope, even when their reality held little of it. In his pocket, his grandfather's compass remained a constant companion, its weight a reminder that true north wasn't just a direction, it was a choice. A daily decision to move forward despite the storms that raged around them. From the 50th floor of Anderson Technologies' glass tower, Thomas Anderson's corner office offered a panoramic view of Boston's skyline, a daily reminder of how far he'd climbed from his working-class roots. At 62, his silver hair and tailored suits projected success, but behind his steel blue eyes lurked a growing storm. The empire he'd built over 3 decades was crumbling, betrayed by the one person he trusted most. Robert Maxwell, his CFO and best friend of 25 years, had orchestrated a sophisticated $50 million fraud scheme, siphoning money from the company's charitable foundation funds meant for underprivileged students and medical research. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. Maxwell had been best man at Thomas's wedding, godfather to his late daughter, and a shoulder to cry on when cancer took both his wife and child within a year of each other. The morning's Wall Street Journal lay unopened on his mahogany desk, its headline already burning in his mind: Anderson Technologies under federal investigation. His phone hadn't stopped ringing, board members demanding explanations, shareholders threatening lawsuits, reporters hungry for scandal. But it was the smaller headlines that truly haunted him: foundation scholarship programs suspended, cancer research grants frozen. Thomas's mind wandered to James Carter, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in decades. 25 years ago, before Anderson Technologies, before the wealth and status, James had pulled him from a burning car wreck on a deserted highway. The accident should have killed him, but James's quick action and complete disregard for his own safety had given Thomas a second chance at life. They'd become friends, sharing dreams over cheap coffee, James of becoming a teacher, Thomas of building a technology empire that would change lives. But life had cruel ways of unraveling dreams. James's descent into addiction happened gradually. Then suddenly, Thomas watched helplessly as his friend disappeared into darkness, his attempts to help repeatedly rejected. The last time he saw James, the man was barely recognizable, refusing rehab for the 3rd time. Thomas had walked away that day, focusing instead on building his company and the foundation that would help others avoid similar fates. Now, as federal investigators combed through his company's records, Thomas faced his own kind of addiction to success, to control, to the image he'd carefully cultivated. The painting on his office wall, a stark black and white photograph of Boston's poorest neighborhood, served as a daily reminder of where he came from and what his foundation was meant to achieve. It now seemed to mock him. His executive assistant, Margaret, knocked gently before entering. "Mr. Anderson, the lawyers are ready for you downtown. They say it's crucial to meet before the FBI interview tomorrow." Her eyes held concern. After 15 years, she could read the weight of his burdens. "Also, sir, the cancer ward at Boston General called. Without the foundation's funding." Thomas raised his hand, unable to hear more. The ward had been named after his wife, its research grants a beacon of hope for families like his once was. Now that hope was suspended, another casualty of Maxwell's betrayal. He stood at his window, watching rain clouds gather over the city. In 3 hours, he needed to meet his legal team, but first he had to face the board and explain how his childhood friend had orchestrated the biggest fraud in the company's history. His fingers brushed against an old compass in his pocket, a habit from his trucking days when GPS didn't exist. It was cheap, barely functional, but he kept it as a reminder of simpler times when right and wrong seemed clearer. The irony wasn't lost on him that today, surrounded by cutting-edge technology, he felt more lost than ever. The rain began to fall as Thomas gathered his documents. His driver had called in sick, but he preferred to drive himself today anyway. Perhaps the solitude would help him find clarity. As he stepped into his Bentley, thunder rolled across the sky, nature's percussion accompanying the collapse of everything he'd built. Little did he know this stormy evening would lead him to a chance encounter that would not only change his life but would also bring him full circle to a debt unpaid and a promise forgotten. The afternoon that shattered Michael's carefully balanced world began like any other at Jefferson Public Library. He was reshelving books in the reference section when Elizabeth Wright's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Michael Carter, come to my office immediately." The tightness in her tone made his stomach drop. Inside the oak-paneled office, Elizabeth Wright sat rigid behind her desk, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. Beside her stood her son, Bradley, a college freshman home for break, his Letterman jacket a sharp contrast to Michael's worn library uniform. On the desk lay an open rare book collection case, empty. 3 first editions, valued at over $15,000, have disappeared, Mrs. Wright began, her voice dripping with barely contained contempt. "You were the last person logged into the rare books room yesterday evening." She didn't need to finish her implication. It hung heavy in the air between them. "Mrs. Wright, I would never," Michael started, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Save it. The security cameras conveniently malfunctioned during that time period. Bradley here noticed the books missing this morning. While doing inventory, Bradley shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Michael's gaze. "We've already called the police." Michael's world tilted. His mind raced to his mother, to her medical bills, to the precarious house of cards that was their life. A theft accusation would destroy everything: his college chances, his job prospects, their very survival. "Please, Mrs. Wright, check the logs again. I was helping Mrs. Rodriguez with her computer class until closing." "A likely story," she scoffed. "Your kind always has excuses." The words hit like physical blows. "I took a chance hiring you against my better judgment. This is how you repay that trust." Through the office window, Michael could see other library staff gathering, whispering. Faces he'd worked alongside for 2 years now looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. Only Janet, the elderly weekend librarian, seemed troubled by the scene unfolding. "I'm calling your mother," Mrs. Wright continued, reaching for the phone. "Though I doubt she'll be surprised." Like father, like son, they say the casual cruelty of the comment made Michael flinch. His father's struggles with addiction were common knowledge in their small community, a shadow he could never quite escape. "My mother's at chemotherapy today," Michael said quietly, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Please let me explain." "Empty your backpack," she demanded instead. Michael complied, hands shaking as he pulled out his school books, his lunch money carefully wrapped in a paper towel, and his grandfather's compass. Mrs. Wright rifled through everything, her movements aggressive, until she pulled out an envelope. Inside were several $100 bills, money Michael had been saving from his bakery job for his mother's medications. Well, Mrs. Wright's voice dripped with satisfaction. "Quite a sum for someone in your situation." "That's my savings for my mother's medicine," but his protests fell on deaf ears. "You're fired, effective immediately. The police will handle this from here." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Bradley, escort him out. Make sure he doesn't take anything else." As Bradley led him through the library, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the windows. Rain had begun to fall outside, matching the storm in his heart. Staff members he'd considered friends turned away, suddenly busy with tasks. Only Janet met his eyes, concern evident in her gaze. At the front desk, Michael carefully removed his badge and set it down. His fingers brushed the smooth surface one last time. This job had been more than just income. It had been sanctuary, hope, opportunity. Now it was another dream shattered by prejudice and assumption. "Michael," Bradley called as he reached the door. Something in his voice made Michael turn. For a moment it seemed like Bradley might speak, might reveal some truth, but then his mother appeared behind him, and he fell silent. Stepping into the rain, Michael felt the weight of his grandfather's compass in his pocket, its familiar presence both comfort and irony. It had always pointed true north, but right now, every direction seemed to lead to darkness. His phone buzzed, a text from the hospital reminding him of his mother's appointment tomorrow. The medical bills they were barely managing would now become impossible. As he walked away from the library, thunder rolled overhead. Behind him, through the rain-streaked windows, he could see Mrs. Wright watching his departure, her satisfaction evident even through the gloom. What neither of them knew was that this injustice would set in motion a chain of events that would expose far more than just missing books. The rain had intensified by nightfall, turning Boston streets into glistening rivers. Michael walked slowly, his thoughts as dark as the storm clouds above. The weight of the afternoon's events pressed down on him like a physical burden. He'd tried calling the community center about picking up extra hours, but their budget was already stretched thin. His phone, showing 15% battery, held another concerned message from his mother she always could sense when something was wrong. Through the curtain of rain, he spotted a sleek black Bentley pulled over, hazard lights blinking weakly in the gloom. Most nights he would have hurried past such a luxury vehicle. People in his neighborhood had learned to be wary of anything that spoke of wealth. But something made him pause. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see an older man frantically pressing buttons on a dead phone. Michael remembered his mother's words, "Kindness doesn't cost anything, but its absence costs everything." Taking a deep breath, he approached the car's passenger window and gently knocked. The man inside startled, his hand instinctively moving toward the lock before their eyes met through the glass. "Sir, do you need help?" Michael's voice carried clearly despite the rain. The man, distinguished-looking with silver hair and an expensive suit, hesitated before lowering the window slightly. "My phone's dead," the man admitted, frustration evident in his cultured tone. "GPS is gone and I have a crucial meeting downtown." And he checked his Rolex. 25 minutes. "I took a wrong turn trying to avoid traffic." Michael recognized the strain in the man's voice. It was the same tone his mother used when trying to hide her worry. "I know these streets well, sir. I could guide you downtown if you'd like." The offer surprised them both. "That's very kind, but surely you have somewhere to be in this weather." The man, Thomas Anderson, though Michael didn't know it yet, studied him with unexpected intensity. Michael thought of his empty apartment, of the hours ahead trying to figure out how to tell his mother about losing his job. "No, sir, nowhere urgent." After a moment's hesitation, Thomas unlocked the doors. "If you're sure." The interior of the Bentley smelled of leather and something expensive Michael couldn't name. He carefully kept his wet backpack on his lap, conscious of not dripping on the pristine upholstery. "Take the next left," he directed softly. "It's a shortcut through the old warehouse district." As they drove, Michael noticed the man's hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. His jaw clenched with more than just navigation concerns. He recognized the signs of someone carrying a heavy burden. He saw it in the mirror every morning. "Rough day?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Thomas glanced at him, surprised by the perceptiveness. "You could say that," he replied after a pause. "Sometimes life has a way of making you question everything you thought you knew about people." Michael nodded, thinking of Mrs. Wright's accusations. "Yes, sir, it certainly does." They drove in companionable silence for a few blocks, Michael providing quiet directions. The rain drummed on the roof, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere inside the car. When they passed the darkened library, Michael turned away, but not before Thomas noticed his pained expression. "You know," Thomas said suddenly, "I've had days where everything I built seemed to crumble. Days when trust felt like a luxury I couldn't afford anymore." He paused at a red light, looking at Michael. "But then something happens that reminds you there's still good out there." Michael pulled out his grandfather's compass, its familiar weight comforting. "My grandfather used to say that true north doesn't change just because you're lost." He showed it to Thomas. "Sometimes you just need help finding your way back to it." Thomas stared at the compass for a long moment, something flickering in his eyes. Before he could respond, they emerged from the side streets into downtown's bright lights. The law offices loomed ahead, 15 minutes before Thomas's crucial meeting. "Thank you," Thomas said as Michael prepared to step out. "You didn't have to help a stranger tonight." Michael smiled slightly, rain dripping from his jacket. "If it were me, I'd hope someone would do the same." He turned to go, but Thomas called after him. "Wait, at least let me pay you for your time." But Michael was already disappearing into the rain, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness. Thomas sat there, engine idling, thinking about compasses and kindness, about trust and true north. He didn't know then that this brief encounter would change not only his life but the lives of an entire community. Above him, through a break in the storm clouds, a single star shone like hope piercing through darkness. Michael's selfless act in the pouring rain, helping a stranger despite his own devastating day, truly deserves a like. Sadly, life hasn't given him many likes yet. Would you be the first one to appreciate his kindness? Show your support by hitting that like button. The morning after the rain-soaked encounter, Thomas Anderson sat in his office, unable to focus on the mounting legal documents before him. Something about the young man's compass and his words about true north had stirred long-buried memories. Instead of preparing for his FBI interview, he found himself Googling Jefferson Public Library and Michael Carter. What he discovered made his coffee grow cold in its cup. Local community forum post praised an unnamed young man who helped elderly residents with computer classes for free. A church bulletin mentioned a quiet hero who fixed the parish's ancient computers. A community center newsletter thanked an anonymous volunteer who spent evenings tutoring underprivileged kids. Thomas's assistant, Margaret, knocked and entered with more crisis management documents. "Sir, I did that background check you requested on the Carter family." She hesitated, then continued. "Sarah Carter, former elementary school teacher, currently battling stage 3 breast cancer. Son Michael, 4.0 GPA, works multiple jobs. And the father, James Carter." Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he took the file. The photo, though 20 years older, was unmistakable. James Carter, the same man who had pulled him from that burning wreck decades ago. The same friend he'd lost to addiction. The compass in the boy's pocket suddenly made sense. He'd given it to James the day after the accident. "There's more," Margaret continued. "The library incident yesterday, I spoke to Janet Williams, a weekend librarian there. She's quite distressed about the whole thing. Says the theft accusation doesn't add up." Thomas leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, a disturbing pattern emerged. Elizabeth Wright had a history of discriminatory behavior, carefully hidden behind proper paperwork. Her son Bradley had been caught stealing before, but charges were mysteriously dropped. The security camera malfunction coincided perfectly with Bradley's presence in the rare books room. Sir, Margaret added hesitantly, "There's a connection to our foundation scandal. Mrs. Wright's brother works for Maxwell Holdings. He's on their board." Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place. The missing books, the fraudulent scholarships, the connected players. It wasn't just about Michael anymore. This was systemic corruption touching everything from his company to the local library. He made some calls. His private investigator reported back within hours. Bradley Wright had been selling rare books on the black market for months, using his mother's position as cover. The money funded a gambling addiction that his mother desperately tried to hide. The same pattern of security camera malfunctions appeared multiple times. But what struck Thomas most were the small details about Michael. Security footage from other days showed him staying late to help elderly patrons, using his lunch break to teach homeless men how to create email accounts, quietly leaving his dinner for a hungry kid pretending to study. "Get me everything on Sarah Carter's medical bills," Thomas instructed Margaret. The numbers that came back were staggering. The Carters were drowning in debt, yet Michael had never missed a payment, somehow managing to piece together enough from his multiple jobs. Thomas sat back, remembering James's words from 20 years ago. Sometimes the people who deserve the most help are the ones who never ask for it. He'd failed James back then, walking away when things got tough. Now life had given him a second chance through James's son. His phone buzzed another crisis meeting about the foundation scandal. But Thomas had already made his decision. He pulled out his own compass, a luxury version James had teased him about buying after the accident. It had never worked as well as the simple one he'd given James. "Margaret," he called, "cancel my meetings, and get me the contact information for every board member at Jefferson Library. Also call my lawyers. We're going to need them, but not for what they think." As he stood to leave, his eyes fell on the Wall Street Journal headline about his company's scandal. Next to it sat the community newsletter with its small mention of an anonymous volunteer. Two worlds about to collide in ways no one could predict. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again. A message from the FBI. They'd found new evidence in the foundation case, but for the first time since the scandal broke, Thomas felt something close to hope. Sometimes finding your way back to true north meant facing the storms you'd been avoiding. He picked up his coat, pausing at the photo of Boston's poorest neighborhood on his wall. Somewhere in those streets, a young man with an old compass was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, unaware that everything was about to change. "Margaret," he said, turning back, "one more thing. Find out who's handling Sarah Carter's cancer treatment, and get me everything you can on experimental treatments we could fund." He smiled slightly. It's time we remembered what this foundation was really meant for. As he headed for his car, thunder rolled again across Boston's sky. Another storm was coming, but this time Thomas Anderson was ready to face it with truth as his compass and redemption as his destination. The hospital waiting room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Michael's exhausted face as he gripped his mother's frail hand. Sarah Carter's latest chemotherapy session had gone terribly wrong, her body rejecting the treatment in a violent way that left her shaking and feverish in the emergency room. The doctors spoke in hushed, urgent tones about complications and the need for more aggressive treatment options their insurance wouldn't cover. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, though her pale face and trembling hands betrayed her words. Just a little setback. She tried to smile, but a wave of pain made her wince instead. Michael noticed how the hospital gown seemed to swallow her shrinking frame, how the blue veins stood out stark against her too pale skin. Dr. Thompson, their longtime oncologist, pulled Michael aside while a nurse adjusted Sarah's IV. His face carried the weight of news no one wanted to deliver. "The cancer has spread more aggressively than we anticipated," he explained quietly. "There's a new treatment protocol that could help," but he hesitated, knowing their financial situation all too well. "It's experimental, not covered by insurance. The cost would be substantial." Michael's mind raced to his empty savings account, the lost library job, the mounting bills already threatening to drown them. How substantial, he asked, though he already knew any amount would be too much. $300,000, Dr. Thompson replied softly. "I'm sorry, Michael. I wish I had better options." The number hit like a physical blow. Michael steadied himself against the wall, his grandfather's compass a dead weight in his pocket. The true north it promised seemed further away than ever. Word of Sarah's condition spread quickly through their tight-knit community. Mrs. Rodriguez from the computer class brought homemade soup. Mr. Wilson, whose computer Michael had fixed countless times, organized a small fundraiser at his church. Even Janet from the library secretly dropped off groceries, slipping away before anyone could see her. But their kindness, though touching, barely made a dent in the mountain of medical bills. Michael took on more hours at the bakery, started doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, anything to earn extra money. He sold his laptop, keeping only the ancient desktop computer he used to help his community center kids. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. One evening, as he sat beside his sleeping mother's hospital bed working on job applications, a nurse brought in the mail. Among the bills and payment notices was a letter that made his heart stop, a final warning from their landlord. They were 3 months behind on rent. Sarah stirred, catching sight of his troubled expression. "Show me," she demanded weakly. Michael tried to hide the letter, but she insisted. As she read, tears filled her eyes. "Oh, my sweet boy, you've been carrying so much." "We'll figure it out, Mom," Michael promised, though he had no idea how. "You just focus on getting better." "Your father," Sarah began hesitantly. "Maybe if we could find him." Michael shook his head firmly. "We can't depend on him, Mom. Not after everything." The memory of his father's last visit, the broken promises and stolen rent money, still burned. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. A code blue was being called several rooms down. As medical staff rushed past their door, Sarah's monitor began beeping erratically. Her face went ashen, breath coming in short gasps. "Mom," Michael's voice cracked with fear. "Mom." The next few minutes were chaos. Dr. Thompson and nurses rushed in. Words like cardiac episode and immediate intervention floated above Michael as he was gently but firmly pushed out of the room. Through the window, he watched helplessly as they worked to stabilize his mother, his whole world contained in that small hospital room. Hours later, Sarah was stable but weaker than ever. Dr. Thompson's face was grave as he explained the situation. Without the experimental treatment, her chances were diminishing rapidly. They had weeks, maybe months. In the quiet of the late-night hospital room, Michael held his mother's hand while she slept. The steady beep of monitors provided a rhythm to his thoughts. He pulled out his grandfather's compass, studying its weathered face in the dim light. "I don't know which way is north anymore, Grandpa," he whispered to the empty room. "I don't know how to fix this." A soft knock at the door made him look up. A nurse entered with a sympathetic smile. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "I know it's past visiting hours, but he was quite insistent." Michael turned, expecting perhaps Mr. Wilson or one of their other neighbors. Instead, he found himself looking at Thomas Anderson, the man from the rainy night. He stood in the doorway, his expensive suit incongruous in the sterile hospital setting. "Hello, Michael," Thomas said quietly. "I think it's time we had a talk about True North." In Sarah's monitor, another heartbeat registered, steady and strong. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break over Boston's skyline, bringing with it the promise of either salvation or heartbreak, though neither man yet knew which. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Boston University fell silent as Thomas Anderson laid out the evidence. Before him sat the admissions board, Elizabeth Wright, and her brother Robert Maxwell, the same Maxwell who had orchestrated the fraud at Anderson Technologies. The coincidence was no longer surprising. "Let me be clear," Thomas began, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Over the past 3 years, 28 students with significantly lower qualifications were admitted to this university's computer science program over more qualified candidates." He slid folders across the polished table. All of these students had one thing in common: connections to board members or substantial donors. Elizabeth Wright shifted uncomfortably as Thomas continued. Meanwhile, students like Michael Carter with perfect GPAs and demonstrated community service were rejected. He clicked a remote, and the wall screen displayed Michael's rejection letter alongside Bradley Wright's acceptance. Bradley sat scores a full 400 points lower. "This is preposterous," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice shrill. "You have no right to access these records." "Actually, Mrs. Wright, as the primary donor to the university's Technology Scholarship Fund, I have every right." Thomas's voice remained calm. "The same fund, I might add, that your brother helped embezzle from." The room erupted in murmurs. Dean Harrison, a man known for his political acumen, cleared his throat. "Mr. Anderson, these are serious allegations, but surely you understand the complexities of university admissions." "Complexities?" Thomas's laugh held no humor. "Is that what we're calling systematic discrimination?" Now he produced another document. 2 days ago, Mrs. Wright accused Michael Carter of stealing rare books from Jefferson Library. Interestingly, the security cameras malfunctioned at exactly the right time, just as they did when Bradley Wright was seen entering the rare books room. Elizabeth's face went pale. Her brother stood abruptly. "This is a witch hunt. You're just trying to deflect from your own company's scandal." "Sit down," Robert Thomas commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "Or shall we discuss the offshore accounts where you've been hiding the foundation's money? The same accounts that trace back to certain board members in this room." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas continued, his voice softer but no less intense. "Michael Carter works 3 jobs to support his mother through cancer treatments. He volunteers teaching computer skills to underprivileged kids. He maintains a perfect GPA despite working 40 hours a week. And yet somehow, Bradley Wright, with his C average and gambling debts, was deemed more worthy of admission." Dean Harrison wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Anderson?" "A complete audit of the admissions process. Immediate review of all scholarship allocations." And Thomas paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "A public acknowledgement of these discriminatory practices." "You'll destroy the university's reputation," someone protested. "The university is destroying its own reputation," Thomas countered. "But I'm offering a chance for redemption." He opened his laptop. "I have a press release prepared. Option 1, the university acknowledges the problem, implements transparent admission policies, and establishes a new merit-based scholarship program that I will personally fund. Option 2, this evidence goes to every major news outlet tomorrow morning." Elizabeth Wright suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is about more than just Michael Carter, isn't it?" Her voice trembled. "You're trying to expose everything." "Everything?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You mean like how your son Bradley has been selling rare books on the black market? Or how your brother helped orchestrate the largest fraud in my company's history? Or perhaps you're referring to the systematic discrimination against students of color in your library, hiring practices. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Dean Harrison's face had gone from red to ashen. "Mr. Anderson, surely we can discuss this privately." "No more private discussions," Thomas declared. "No more swept under the rug deals. This ends now." He stood, straightening his tie. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Either we fix this together or I burn it all down and we rebuild from the ashes." As if on cue, his phone buzzed a message from the hospital about Sarah Carter's condition. Thomas looked at the assembled board members, their faces a mix of fear, anger, and shame. While you debate your reputations and positions, a brilliant young man is watching his mother die because he couldn't afford the education that could have given him a better job, better insurance, better options. He packed his briefcase deliberately. Your actions, your prejudices, your complexities, they have real consequences for real people. Walking to the door, he turned one last time. "Oh, and Mrs. Wright, the police would like to speak with Bradley about those missing books. I suggest you have him return them before things get worse." The door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow sounded like thunder. In the hallway, Margaret waited with more files. "The press is already asking questions about the admission pattern," she reported, "and Janet from the library sent over more documentation about Mrs. Wright's discriminatory practices." Thomas nodded, checking his watch. "Keep the pressure on. And Margaret, make sure Michael Carter's admission letter for next semester is on my desk by morning. It's time that compass of his pointed towards something better." As they walked out of the building, students rushed past, unaware of the storm brewing in the conference room behind them. Thomas thought about Michael, probably sitting by his mother's hospital bed right now, still unaware that his world was about to change. Sometimes, he reflected, true north wasn't just a direction, it was a revolution. The hospital cafeteria's harsh lighting did nothing to soften James Carter's weathered face as he sat across from his son, 5 years of absence stretching between them like an ocean. His hands, once steady enough to save a stranger from a burning car, now trembled around a paper coffee cup. His eyes, bloodshot but clear for the first time in years, couldn't quite meet Michael's steely gaze. "Your mother," James began, his voice rough from years of hard living. "The nurse said she's getting worse." He looked down at his coffee, the words hanging heavy in the air. "I saw in the papers what Thomas Anderson is doing at the university. That's how I found you." Michael's jaw tightened. "We've managed fine without you." The bitterness in his voice made James flinch. "Why are you really here, Dad?" "I'm 6 months clean," James offered, pulling out a sobriety chip from his pocket. "Been staying at St. Mary's Recovery Center. Working as a maintenance man there." He paused, gathering courage. "I heard about the experimental treatment Mom needs. I want to help." A harsh laugh escaped Michael's throat. "Help? Like you helped when you stole our rent money? Or when you promised to come to my graduation and ended up in a crack house instead?" "I deserve that," James acknowledged softly. "I deserve all of it. But Michael, I'm different now. The program, it's helped me understand." "Understand what?" Michael interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Understand how it feels to watch Mom wither away while working 3 jobs. Understand what it's like to be accused of theft because people look at me and see you." An elderly couple at the next table glanced over sympathetically. James waited until they looked away before continuing. "I know I can't fix the past, but I've been saving every penny from my job. It's not much, but it's something. And I've got skills I could help with the medical bills, maybe find work." "Stop," Michael stood abruptly. "Just stop. You don't get to walk back into our lives when it's convenient. Mom needed you 5 years ago. I needed you. Where were you then?" Before James could answer, Thomas Anderson appeared at their table, his presence unexpected but somehow fitting. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what he was interrupting. "Mr. Anderson," Michael acknowledged, grateful for the interruption. But Thomas was looking at James, recognition and something else, regret, perhaps crossing his face. "Hello, James," Thomas said quietly. "It's been a long time." James stood slowly, recognition dawning. "Thomas?" I didn't know you knew Michael." "Your son helped me find my way when I was lost," Thomas replied, the weight of the words carrying multiple meanings, something he must have learned from somewhere. An uncomfortable silence fell. Michael looked between the two men, confusion evident on his face. Thomas cleared his throat. "James, I failed you 20 years ago. I walked away when things got hard. Maybe if I'd tried harder." "No," James interrupted firmly. "My demons were my own. You tried to help. I wasn't ready." "And now," Thomas asked. James straightened slightly. 6 months clean. Working. Trying to make amends, he glanced at Michael. "Though some bridges might be too burned to rebuild." Thomas nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Michael. "Your mother's new treatment begins tomorrow. The specialist is optimistic." He paused. "She asked for both of you to be there." Michael's protest died on his lips as Thomas continued. "Sometimes, son, the hardest direction to follow isn't north or south, it's forward. And sometimes moving forward means letting go of the weight of the past." James stepped forward hesitantly. "Michael, I know I don't deserve another chance. But your mother, she always said that true north isn't just about finding your way. It's about helping others find theirs too." Michael fingered the compass in his pocket, his grandfather's compass, given to his father, passed down with both love and pain. The same compass that had led him to help Thomas that rainy night. The same compass that had somehow led his father back to them. "The treatment," Michael said finally. "You said you've been saving money." James nodded eagerly. "Every penny. And St. Mary's, they've offered me a full-time position, benefits. A real chance." Thomas watched the exchange silently, remembering another conversation 20 years ago, another chance at redemption offered and lost. But maybe this time. "I can't promise anything," Michael said slowly. "And if you disappear again—" "I won't," James interrupted. "I swear on your grandfather's compass." Michael looked at Thomas, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Mom's treatment starts at 9 tomorrow," Michael said finally. "Don't be late." As James left, hope and fear warring on his face, Thomas placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Your father pulled me from a burning car once," he said quietly. "Saved my life without thinking twice. Maybe some of that man is still in there." Michael watched his father's retreating back, the compass heavy in his pocket. Maybe, he agreed softly. But this time he's the one who needs saving. Above them, through the hospital windows, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the treatment, the university scandal, the long road of rebuilding trust. But for now, in this moment, 3 generations of broken compass needles began, ever so slightly, to align toward true north once again. The university's grand auditorium buzzed with tension as students, faculty, and press filled every seat. The emergency town hall meeting called to address the admissions scandal had drawn national media attention. CNN and Fox News vans crowded the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the stormy sky like modern gargoyles. Dean Harrison stood at the podium, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous tremor in his hands. "We've called this meeting to address certain allegations regarding our admissions process," he began, but was immediately interrupted by shouts from the audience. "Tell us about Bradley Wright," someone called out. "Why did he get in with a C average? What about the missing scholarship money?" Elizabeth Wright sat rigid in the front row, her son Bradley noticeably absent. Beside her, her brother Robert Maxwell whispered urgently into a phone, his face ashen. The controversy had exploded beyond their control, fueled by leaked documents showing years of discriminatory practices. Thomas Anderson rose from his seat, commanding attention without speaking a word. The room fell silent as he walked to the podium. Behind him, Michael Carter entered quietly, accompanied by Janet from the library and several other students who had been unfairly rejected. "Let me tell you a story," Thomas began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "A story about a young man who works 3 jobs to support his sick mother, who maintains a perfect GPA while teaching computer skills to underprivileged children, who helps strangers on rainy nights expecting nothing in return." He paused, letting his words sink in. This young man was denied admission to this university, while others with far lower qualifications were accepted because of their connections or their parents' wealth. Elizabeth Wright stood abruptly. "You have no right." "I have every right," Thomas cut her off. "As the primary donor to this university's technology program and as someone who believes in merit over privilege, I have not just the right but the obligation to speak." He projected a series of documents onto the massive screen behind him. SAT scores, GPAs, acceptance letters, rejection letters. The pattern was undeniable. For years, this institution has systematically discriminated against qualified candidates based on race and economic status. Thomas continued. This same corruption extended to the local library, where Mrs. Wright falsely accused Michael Carter of theft to cover up her own son's crimes. The audience gasped as security camera footage played, showing Bradley Wright removing books from the rare books room. Elizabeth Wright's face crumpled as her carefully constructed world began to collapse. But this isn't just about Michael. Thomas pressed on. It's about every student who was denied an opportunity because they didn't have the right connections or the right color skin. It's about a system that perpetuates inequality while pretending to promote merit. Robert Maxwell suddenly stood. You're one to talk about corruption, Anderson. What about the $50 million missing from your foundation? Thomas smiled grimly. I'm glad you brought that up, Robert. Would you like to explain to everyone how that money disappeared into offshore accounts connected to your family? Or shall I? The room erupted in chaos. Journalists shouted questions. Students began chanting for justice. Dean Harrison looked like he might faint. In the midst of the storm, Michael stepped forward to the podium. His quiet presence somehow commanded more attention than all the shouting. I never wanted to be part of a scandal, he said simply. I just wanted a fair chance, like every other student here who was rejected not because they weren't good enough, but because they weren't privileged enough. Elizabeth Wright's composure finally broke. Bradley confessed, she announced, suddenly her voice cracking. He stole the books. He's been stealing for months. I covered it up. I falsified evidence against Michael to protect my son. The admission sent another wave of shock through the audience. Thomas returned to the podium, laying out his demands: a complete overhaul of the admissions process, a new merit-based scholarship program, and immediate resignation of those involved in the corruption. This university stands at a crossroads, he declared. We can either continue down the path of privilege and discrimination, or we can choose to become what we've always claimed to be, a place where merit and hard work determine success. The board members huddled together, whispering urgently. Dean Harrison wiped his brow repeatedly. The press cameras clicked incessantly. Finally, Dean Harrison approached the podium, looking decades older than he had an hour ago. The board has agreed to Mr. Anderson's terms, he announced wearily, and I hereby tender my resignation, effective immediately. One by one, other resignations followed. Elizabeth Wright left the auditorium in tears, followed by reporters. Robert Maxwell was met at the door by FBI agents. As the chaos subsided, Thomas found Michael standing quietly by the window, watching the storm clouds finally break over the campus. You okay? He asked. Michael nodded, touching the compass in his pocket. Mom's treatment is working, he said softly. Dad's still sober. And now. This he turned to Thomas. Why did you do it? Why go to all this trouble? Thomas smiled, remembering a burning car and a stranger's kindness 2 decades ago. Because sometimes, Michael, true north isn't just about finding your own way. It's about clearing the path for others to find theirs. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the university quad. Change was coming not just to the university, but to an entire system built on privilege and prejudice. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness on a rainy night. The hospital corridor echoed with the urgent scream of monitors as Sarah Carter's body rejected the experimental treatment. Michael burst through the doors of the ICU, his father James close behind, both of them still wearing the suits they'd worn to the university hearing. Thomas Anderson stood by the nurses' station, already on the phone with specialists across the country. BP's dropping, a nurse called out. We need Dr. Thompson in here now. Sarah lay pale against the white sheets, tubes and wires creating a technological web around her fragile form. The experimental treatment that had shown such promise was now threatening her life. Michael reached for her hand, finding it cold and clammy. Mom, please, he whispered. Stay with us, we need you. James hovered at the doorway, the weight of his past failures written across his face. 6 months of sobriety felt meaningless in the face of 5 years of absence. Sarah, his voice cracked. I'm here. I'm finally here. Dr. Thompson rushed in, immediately assessing the situation. The treatment's causing a severe autoimmune response, he explained rapidly. Her body's attacking itself, he turned to the nurses. Start her on immunosuppressants and get the crash cart in here just in case. Michael felt the world tilting. After everything, the university scandal, his father's return, Thomas's intervention, it couldn't end like this. His fingers found his grandfather's compass in his pocket, but for the first time it offered no comfort. There's another option, Thomas said from the doorway. He'd ended his call and now held a tablet displaying medical data, an experimental protocol from a clinic in Switzerland. It's risky, but... No more experiments, James interrupted, suddenly stepping fully into the room. Haven't we gambled enough with her life? The two men locked eyes, decades of history passing between them. Like you gambled with her life when you disappeared, Thomas shot back. At least I'm trying to save her. Stop it, Michael's voice cut through their tension. Both of you. This isn't about your past. This is about Mom. Sarah's monitor beeped more urgently. Dr. Thompson moved quickly, adjusting medications. We need to make a decision now, he stressed. The Swiss protocol, or we withdraw the current treatment. There's no middle ground. Michael looked at his mother's face, seeing echoes of every sacrifice she'd made for him. Every extra shift she'd worked before getting sick. Every encouraging smile, even when bills overwhelmed them. Every time she'd defended James's absence, protecting their son from the full weight of abandonment. Michael James stepped closer, his voice steady for the first time. Son, let me do this. Let me make the decision, if anything goes wrong. You don't get to sweep in and play hero now, Michael snapped. Where were you during the first rounds of chemo? Where were you when she worked double shifts with cancer to keep me in school? The monitor screamed again. Dr. Thompson barked orders as nurses rushed in with more equipment. Sarah's eyes fluttered open briefly, finding first Michael's face, then James's. My boy, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical chaos. Both, here. Her eyes closed again as another wave of alarms filled the room. Decision time, Dr. Thompson pressed. Now. Michael felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. His compass seemed to burn in his pocket, not pointing north, but pointing toward a choice that could save or end his mother's life. Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't making the choice yourself, he said softly. It's trusting others to help make it. Michael looked at his father, really looked at him for the first time since his return. Behind the weathered face and regretful eyes, he saw something new: clarity, determination. The man who had once pulled a stranger from a burning car without thought for his own safety. Dad, Michael said, his voice breaking. What do you think? James straightened, years of addiction and shame falling away as he stepped into the role he should have occupied all along, Sarah's protector. He studied the medical data Thomas had brought, asked Dr. Thompson rapid, clear questions about risks and alternatives. Finally, he looked at his son. The Swiss protocol, he said firmly. Your mother always said that fear of failure shouldn't stop us from trying. That's what she taught you, isn't it? What made you help a stranger on a rainy night? Michael nodded, tears streaming freely now. Dr. Thompson immediately began implementing the new treatment protocol while Thomas stepped out to make arrangements for the Swiss medical team. In the chaos of medical activity, James found himself next to his son. Without words, he pulled Michael into an embrace, their first in 5 years. Michael resisted for a moment, then collapsed into his father's arms, letting out years of stored pain and fear. I've got you, son, James whispered. I've got you both now, and I'm never letting go again. Above them, the hospital's fluorescent lights flickered like stars in an artificial sky. On the bed, Sarah's monitors began to stabilize as the new treatment took hold. And in Michael's pocket, his grandfather's compass finally settled, pointing toward a new kind of true north, one where broken families could heal, where second chances weren't just dreams, and where the hardest journey sometimes led right back home. In this moment of intense emotion between Michael and his father, their hearts finally reconnecting, I can't help but wonder, would you join us on this journey of healing and redemption? Subscribe to follow their story, and let's witness together how love can mend even the deepest wounds. The headline splashed across the Wall Street Journal hit like a thunderbolt: Anderson's redemption story PR stunt to cover massive fraud. Below it, photos of Thomas with Michael at the hospital, their university confrontation, and documents about Sarah's experimental treatment painted a carefully crafted narrative of manipulation. Robert Maxwell had launched his counterattack. Through a series of strategic leaks and carefully planted stories, he portrayed Thomas's involvement with the Carters as an elaborate scheme to distract from the original Foundation scandal. The story suggested that Michael was a paid actor, Sarah's illness exaggerated, and James's return suspiciously timed. Sources close to Anderson Technologies claim the CEO orchestrated the university scandal to overshadow his own company's financial misconduct. The article read, "The heartwarming story of a disadvantaged student and his sick mother provided perfect cover for Anderson's alleged embezzlement." Thomas sat in his office watching his phone explode with calls from board members and investors. Outside, reporters crowded the lobby, hungry for comments. The company's stock had plunged 15% in pre-market trading. "They're calling for an emergency board meeting," Margaret reported, her face tight with concern. "Maxwell's lawyers have filed a countersuit, claiming you used company funds for Sarah's treatment to curry public favor." Thomas glanced at the compass on his desk, not James's old one, but a new one he'd bought after meeting Michael. "Get me Michael on the phone," he said quietly. But Michael was already there, bursting into the office with a newspaper in hand. "Mr. Anderson, I can explain to them. Tell them the truth. I'll do interviews." "No," Thomas cut him off firmly. "You focus on your mother. This is my fight." "But they're destroying everything you've built." "Because of me, because you helped us." "Because it was the right thing to do," Thomas interrupted. "And that hasn't changed." The boardroom meeting that followed was brutal. Maxwell's allies painted Thomas as a man who'd lost his grip on reality, using company resources for personal crusades. They presented emails doctored to suggest the university scandal was orchestrated months in advance. "We move for an immediate vote of no confidence," Maxwell's lawyer announced smugly. "Mr. Anderson's emotional involvement with the Carter family has compromised his judgment and our company's integrity." Thomas stood alone at the head of the table, feeling the weight of betrayal from people he'd worked with for decades. But as he prepared to defend himself, the boardroom doors burst open. Janet from the library entered, followed by several students who'd been rejected from the university. "Sorry we're late," she announced, dropping a thick file on the table. "But we thought the board might want to see Mr. Maxwell's other activities before voting." The documents revealed a pattern of corruption extending far beyond the Foundation fraud. Maxwell had been running similar schemes at other institutions, using the stolen money to buy influence and manipulate admissions across multiple universities. And this, Janet added, placing a final document down as Bradley Wright's signed confession about who really orchestrated the rare book's theft. Turns out it wasn't just about gambling debts, it was about hiding evidence of much bigger crimes. The boardroom erupted in chaos as Maxwell lunged for the documents. Security guards restrained him as FBI agents entered the room, the same ones who'd been building a case against him for months. "You really think this changes anything?" Maxwell snarled at Thomas. "You've still used company resources for your personal charity case. The shareholders." "The shareholders," Thomas interrupted calmly, "might be interested to know that while you were stealing from our foundation, I was funding Sarah Carter's treatment with my own money. Every penny documented, all above board." He pulled out his phone, displaying bank transfers and medical billing statements. "You see, Robert, unlike you, I never forgot what this company was built for, to help people who deserve a chance. The Carters reminded me of that. They reminded me of True North." As Maxwell was led away in handcuffs, Thomas turned to his board. "Now, shall we discuss the real future of Anderson Technologies? One where we remember that profit and purpose aren't mutually exclusive." Outside his window, the morning sun broke through storm clouds, casting long shadows across the city. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, the darkest attacks led to the clearest victories, and sometimes True North meant standing your ground even when the whole world seemed to be pointing south. In the sterile quiet of the hospital's surgical floor, Michael stared at the consent forms until the words blurred together. The Swiss treatment protocol had stabilized Sarah, but her doctors had discovered a new complication, a tumor pressing against her spine. Emergency surgery was needed, a procedure so risky that the hospital required both Michael and James's signatures. "The success rate is 30%, Dr. Thompson explained gently. "Without it, the paralysis will be permanent within weeks. With it, there's a 15% chance you might not survive the procedure. James gripped the back of a chair so hard his knuckles turned white. 6 months of sobriety felt like nothing in the face of this crushing fear. The urge to run to find chemical comfort clawed at him with familiar intensity. But when he looked at his son's face, he found the strength to stay. The cost Michael started, his voice cracking. Thomas's legal battles had forced him to temporarily freeze many of his assets, including the medical fund he'd established for Sarah. The Swiss treatment had depleted their savings and their insurance had reached its lifetime maximum. "I'll sell the house," James said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "The house I inherited from my father. I've been keeping it maintained, waiting, hoping someday to make it a home again. It's worth enough to cover the surgery." Michael stared at his father. The house had been their family home before everything fell apart, the last connection to his grandfather. "Dad, no, that's all you have left." "No," James corrected softly. "You and your mother are all I have left. The house is just bricks and memories, some of them good, some bad. But this," he gestured to Sarah's room, where she slept fitfully. "This is our future." The realtor came that afternoon, papers signed in the hospital cafeteria. James's hand shook, but his signature was clear. As the realtor left, he pulled out his sobriety chip, turning it over and over. "When I first got clean," he said to Michael, "I had this dream of fixing up the house, making it right again. Thought maybe someday you and your mom might. But dreams don't mean much without action, without sacrifice." Michael watched his father, this man he'd hated and missed in equal measure for 5 years, sign away his last worldly possession without hesitation. Something shifted in his heart, a crack in the wall he'd built against forgiveness. The surgery was scheduled for dawn. Throughout the night, James and Michael sat at Sarah's bedside. She drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time she opened her eyes, she found them both there, keeping vigil. "My boys," she whispered once, reaching for their hands. "Both still here." "Always," James promised, and for the first time in years, Michael believed him. As the surgical team came to prep Sarah, Dr. Thompson pulled them aside. "The next few hours will be critical. You should both try to rest." Instead, they found themselves in the hospital chapel. Neither was particularly religious, but the quiet space offered refuge from the harsh medical realities outside. Michael pulled out his grandfather's compass, placing it on the small altar. "He gave me this the day he died," James said quietly. "Told me as long as I had it, I'd never truly be lost." He laughed bitterly. "Didn't work out that way." "Maybe it did," Michael responded, surprising them both. "You found your way back." James wiped his eyes. "At what cost? Your mother's suffering, your struggles, years we can't get back. And now you're giving up everything you have left to save her." "It's not giving up," James corrected. "It's giving back. There's a difference." As dawn broke through the chapel's stained glass, casting colored light across the compass on the altar, father and son sat in silence. Outside, Sarah was being wheeled into surgery, her life hanging in the balance. But in that quiet moment, something else was being operated on the wounded heart of a family. Cut open and examined, its broken pieces finally beginning to heal. The compass needle pointed steadily north, unwavering in the morning light. Sometimes it seemed to say the hardest sacrifices led to the truest direction. And sometimes the things we thought we needed to keep turned out to be the very things we needed to let go. The community center's meeting room was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling out into the hallway. Elizabeth Wright stood at the podium, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Before her sat faces she'd spent years overlooking: parents who couldn't afford college application fees, students rejected despite perfect grades, community members who'd witnessed her subtle discriminations at the library. "I've spent 30 years," she began, her voice trembling, "believing I was protecting a system of merit. Today I'm here to confess that what I was really protecting was a system of privilege, my son's privilege, our collective delusion of superiority." In the front row, Bradley sat with his head bowed, the weight of his actions visible in his hunched shoulders. Behind him, Janet from the library held a box of recovered rare books, each one representing a piece of their shared share. "My son stole those books," Elizabeth continued, her composure cracking. Not because he needed to, but because he could. Because I had created an environment where he believed rules didn't apply to him. And when the truth threatened to emerge, I did something unforgivable. I blamed an innocent young man. Michael Carter sat quietly in the back, his father James beside him. They'd come at Thomas Anderson's request, though Michael had initially resisted attending another public spectacle. Michael Carter, Elizabeth turned toward him, tears now flowing freely. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth. The truth about why I really rejected your library job application 3 times before finally hiring you. Why I scheduled you for the hardest shift, scrutinized your every move, looked for any excuse to find fault. The room held its breath as Elizabeth pulled out an old newspaper clipping. 20 years ago, my husband was the admissions director at Boston University. He believed in true merit-based admissions, fought against the legacy system. He was fired for refusing to accept underqualified wealthy students. The stress, the humiliation. He took his own life. Gasps rippled through the audience. Elizabeth's hand shook as she continued. When Michael applied to work at the library, his essay about educational equality, his perfect grades despite working multiple jobs, he reminded me so much of what my husband fought for. And I couldn't bear it. It was easier to embrace the corrupt system than to face what it had cost me. Bradley stood suddenly. Mom, please. No, Bradley. They need to hear this. Elizabeth straightened. I taught my son that privilege was his right. I helped him cheat his way into university. I covered up his crimes, and when he needed help with his gambling addiction, I used my position to steal more money to pay his debts. She turned back to Michael. You represented everything my husband believed in: merit, hard work, integrity. And instead of honoring his memory by helping you, I became everything he fought against. From her briefcase, Elizabeth withdrew a stack of documents. These are records of every qualified student I helped reject over the years, every job application I buried, every scholarship I helped divert to less deserving candidates. I've given copies to the authorities, the university board, and the local press. The room erupted in murmurs as she continued. I'm also surrendering my pension to create a scholarship fund for these students. It won't fix what I've done, but it's a start. Finally, she stepped down from the podium and walked directly to Michael. Your grandfather's compass, she said softly. I saw you looking at it once while working. It reminded me of one my husband kept. He said it helped him stay true to his principles. She paused, tears flowing freely now. I lost my true north when I lost him. But watching you, your integrity, despite everything I did to break it, you helped me find it again. Michael stood slowly, looking at this broken woman who had caused him so much pain. Behind her, Bradley approached, holding out a familiar book, Michael's worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that had disappeared from his locker months ago. Sometimes, Michael said quietly, quoting the book, the simple truth is the hardest to see. As Elizabeth and Bradley Wright left the podium in tears, the room sat in stunned silence. Sometimes redemption came from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the greatest act of courage was admitting you had been the villain in someone else's story. In Thomas Anderson's penthouse office, as evening painted the Boston skyline in shades of gold, 3 men sat around a small box of old photographs. James Carter, his hand steady after 6 months of sobriety, lifted out a faded Polaroid that captured a moment from 25 years ago, a younger version of himself pulling Thomas from a burning truck on a deserted highway. The newspapers called it a miracle, Thomas said softly, touching the photo's worn edges. What they didn't report was that the crash wasn't an accident. Someone had tampered with my brakes. Michael leaned forward, his father's compass heavy in his pocket. What are you saying? Your father saved more than my life that night, Thomas continued. He saved evidence that would have been destroyed in that fire documents proving systematic corruption in university admissions across the state, including proof that Elizabeth Wright's husband was murdered. His suicide was staged. James's hands began to shake. The files in the briefcase. I never knew what was in. You just told me to keep them safe, hide them somewhere no one would look. And you hid them in your father's house, Thomas finished. The same house you just sold to pay for Sarah's surgery. Michael looked between the 2 men, pieces falling into place. The house. That's why you really stayed away all those years, isn't it, Dad? You weren't just running from addiction, you were protecting something. James nodded slowly. The addiction was real, my shame, my weakness. But every time I thought about coming home clean, I remembered those files hidden in the walls. Remembered the men who tried to kill Thomas. I was afraid they'd find you and your mother." Thomas pulled out another document, yellowed with age but preserved in plastic. "The day after James saved me, he gave me his compass. Said as long as I had it, I'd find my way to the truth. The next day he disappeared," I thought. "I thought the guilt of leaving you and Sarah broke him. I didn't realize he was protecting all of us." "But why now?" Michael asked. "Why reveal this after all these years?" "Because of you," son James's voice cracked. "When I saw you in the papers with Thomas, saw you fighting the same corrupt system we tried to expose decades ago, I knew it was time. The men who tried to kill Thomas, who killed Elizabeth's husband, they're still out there, still controlling things from the shadows." Thomas stood, walking to his wall safe. "The files your father protected, they're not just history, they're proof of ongoing corruption, connecting everything: the foundation fraud, the university admissions. Even Sarah's experimental treatment being initially denied. It was all part of a system designed to keep power in the hands of a few." He withdrew a thick folder. "Tomorrow this goes to the FBI. Not just Maxwell's crimes, but 25 years of evidence. Names, dates, transactions, everything James protected at the cost of his family." Michael looked at his father with new eyes. The years of absence, the addiction, the shame behind it all had been a different kind of compass, pointing toward a truth too dangerous to face alone. "Your grandfather's compass," James said softly, touching the one in Michael's pocket. "I gave it to you the last time I visited, remember? I was afraid. Afraid they might find the files, afraid they'd trace them back to us. I wanted you to have something to remember me by in case." "In case they found you instead," Michael finished, finally understanding. Thomas touched the compass on his desk, the one James had given him all those years ago. 2 compasses, 2 decades, 1 truth. And now, finally, a chance to make it right. Outside, the sunset painted the city in shades of redemption. In a hospital room across town, Sarah was recovering, unaware that her husband's greatest sacrifice hadn't been selling their house, it had been staying away to keep them safe. Michael held up his grandfather's compass, watching its needle align with the one on Thomas's desk. Sometimes true north wasn't just a direction, it was a legacy of truth, passed down through generations, waiting for the right moment to point toward justice. "Well," James said quietly, "I guess we know which way we're heading now. 3 men, 3 generations of sacrifice and secrets, united by 2 old compasses and 1 unwavering truth. Tomorrow would bring its own storms, but for now they had found their true north together." 1 year later, the Jefferson Community Learning Center opened its doors in what had once been the public library. The building, transformed by Thomas Anderson's foundation and the Carter family's vision, stood as a testament to how truth could reshape a community. Sarah Carter, now in remission, sat in the center's main hall, watching students flow through the doors. Her recovery had been termed miraculous by medical journals, but she knew the real miracle was the family surrounding her. James, looking younger after 18 months of sobriety, worked as the center's maintenance supervisor, his skilled hands now fixing computers instead of hiding secrets. Michael, having just completed his first year at Boston University on a full scholarship, had established a mentoring program that paired underprivileged students with industry professionals. Mrs. Carter, a young girl, approached, clutching a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the same copy that had once disappeared from Michael's locker. "Would you read with us today?" Sarah smiled, remembering her days as a teacher before cancer had interrupted her calling. Now she ran the center's adult literacy program, turning the pain of her journey into purpose for others. The front doors opened and Elizabeth Wright entered quietly. Her transformation was as profound as the building's gone was the rigid librarian who had wielded prejudice like a weapon. She now volunteered, teaching advanced placement prep courses to students who couldn't afford private tutoring. Her son Bradley, after completing rehabilitation, worked with James counseling young people struggling with addiction. Thomas Anderson stood at the back of the hall, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. The FBI investigation had exposed decades of corruption, leading to arrests across multiple institutions. The evidence James had protected for 25 years had finally served its purpose, dismantling a system of privilege that had destroyed countless lives. "Quite a change from the old library," Janet commented, joining Thomas. She now served as the center's director, her years of quiet resistance to Elizabeth's discrimination making her perfect for the role. "Change is just truth in action," Thomas replied, watching Michael guide a group of students through a coding workshop. The young man's journey from falsely accused library worker to community leader had inspired a movement across Boston's educational institutions. The center had become more than just a building. It was a blueprint for transformation replicated in cities across the country. The Anderson Foundation, now overseen by a board that included both Michael and James, funded similar centers nationwide, each one a beacon of merit-based opportunity. Sarah's medical treatment protocol, initially viewed with skepticism, had been approved for wider use, saving lives beyond her own. The hospital wing where she had fought for survival now housed a research center dedicated to making experimental treatments accessible to all patients, regardless of their economic status. James approached his wife, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. The compass he had used to protect dangerous truths now hung in the center's entrance, alongside Thomas's matching one symbols of how direction could be lost and found again. Sometimes, James said softly, watching their son teach, the longest journey leads you right back home. The center's walls, once lined with books alone, now displayed photographs of success story students who had broken through barriers, families reunited, lives transformed. Among them hung the faded Polaroid of James pulling Thomas from the burning truck, a reminder that courage often came disguised as ordinary moments. Through the windows, Boston's skyline caught the afternoon light, the same view that had once seemed to mock Thomas from his corporate office now standing as a backdrop to possibility. The city itself had changed, its educational landscape reshaped by exposed truths and renewed commitments to genuine merit. Michael ended his coding class, his students buzzing with excitement about their projects. He joined his parents and Thomas, the four of them forming a picture of reconciliation that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "The new scholarship applications are in," Michael announced. 300 candidates this year. Sarah squeezed his hand. "And each one will be judged on merit alone." True North, Thomas said quietly, was never about direction. It was about correction. Around them, the center hummed with activity, students learning, lives changing, truth prevailing. The compass needles that had guided their separate journeys had finally aligned, pointing toward a future where opportunity wasn't a privilege but a right, where redemption wasn't just possible but inevitable, and where true north was a destination they had found together. In his office at the Anderson Foundation's new headquarters, Michael Carter studied two framed items on his wall: his grandfather's compass and a newspaper article titled "From False Accusation to Foundation CEO, A Story of Truth and Transformation." At 32, he had become the youngest CEO in the Foundation's history, carrying forward a legacy built on second chances and unwavering integrity. Thomas Anderson's retirement announcement had surprised the business world, but not those who knew him best. His decision to hand the Foundation's leadership to Michael completed a circle that had begun on a rainy night 15 years ago. The corporate empire he'd built still thrived, but its purpose had been fundamentally transformed, now dedicated to exposing educational inequality and funding opportunities for overlooked talent. Sarah, now cancer-free for 14 years, had turned her experience into hope for others. The Sarah Carter Healthcare Initiative, a partnership between the Foundation and major hospitals, ensured that experimental treatments were available to patients regardless of their financial status. Her story had inspired legislation making healthcare accessibility a priority in states across the country. James, marking 16 years of sobriety, had become a respected voice in addiction recovery and educational reform. The secrets he'd protected for decades had led to systematic changes in university admissions nationwide. The house he'd sold to save Sarah now housed a recovery center, its walls no longer hiding dangerous truths but sheltering those seeking their own paths to redemption. Elizabeth Wright and her son Bradley had found their own ways to heal. Bradley's gambling addiction recovery program had become a model for universities nationwide, while Elizabeth's scholarship fund for underprivileged students had grown to support hundreds of scholars annually. Their story of transformation proved that even those who had once perpetuated injustice could become powerful advocates for change. The Jefferson Community Learning Center had spawned 50 similar institutions across the country, each adapting its model of inclusive education and community support. Janet, before retiring, had trained a new generation of directors who understood that true education meant opening doors rather than guarding them. On this particular morning, Michael prepared to announce the Foundation's most ambitious project, yet a nationwide initiative to identify and dismantle systemic barriers in education. The project would carry forward the evidence his father had protected, not just exposing past wrongs, but preventing future ones. A knock at his door revealed Thomas, now in his 70s, but still carrying the quiet strength that had helped reshape so many lives. "Ready for the announcement?" he asked. Michael touched the compass on his wall. "You know, I've been thinking about what true north really means. It's not just about finding your way, it's about showing others theirs." Thomas smiled. "Your grandfather knew that when he gave James this compass. James knew it when he protected those files. And you proved it when you helped a lost old man on a rainy night." They walked together to the conference room, where Sarah and James waited with the press. The story they were about to tell wasn't just about corruption exposed or systems changed. It was about how small acts of kindness could ripple outward, transforming lives across generations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, standing at the podium. 15 years ago, I learned that true north isn't a direction, it's a choice. A choice to help others when we're hurting ourselves. A choice to protect truth when lies seem safer. A choice to believe in second chances when the world tells us people can't change." He gestured to his family, his mother who had beaten death, his father who had overcome addiction, his mentor who had chosen truth over power. This foundation's new initiative isn't just about funding or programs. It's about recognizing that every person has a compass inside them pointing toward their best self. Our job is to help them find it, trust it, and follow it. As applause filled the room, Michael caught his father's eye. James nodded slightly, pride and peace replacing the shame that had once haunted him. Sarah wiped away tears, her free hand clasped with Thomas's, the unlikely family that truth had built. Outside, Boston's skyline stretched toward a bright horizon. Somewhere in the city, another young person was facing their own moment of choice, their own test of integrity, their own chance to find true north. And thanks to the legacy of two old compasses and the people who had followed them, they wouldn't have to make that journey alone. As our journey with Michael, Thomas, and the Carter family comes to a close, we're deeply moved by how this story has touched so many hearts. If you found meaning in their path to redemption, please support our storytelling team by subscribing to our channel and sharing this video with loved ones who might need a reminder about second chances. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of true north, and share your thoughts in the comments below. How has this story resonated with you? And the burning question, should we explore what happens next in part 2? Let us know.